NASA saw the foam strike on day 2. Engineers inside the agency requested satellite imagery to assess the damage. The request was denied. They requested it again. It was canceled. A third pathway to obtain images was blocked before the request cleared the building. For 16 days, 7 astronauts conducted science experiments aboard a spacecraft with a hole in its wing. They did not know about the hole. They were not told about the foam strike. They were not told that engineers on the ground had spent a week running damage models, writing alarmed internal emails, and watching mission management dismiss the problem as not worth pursuing. On February 1st, 2003, Space Shuttle Columbia entered the atmosphere at 12,500 miles per hour. The crew had approximately 8 minutes from the first indication of abnormal heating before loss of consciousness. The spacecraft broke apart over Texas and Louisiana, scattering debris across a field more than 2,000 miles long. All 7 crew members were killed. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board, after 7 months of work, produced a report that ran to 248 pages. Its central finding was not that NASA had been surprised. Its central finding was that NASA had known, in various forms, with various degrees of clarity, and had organized itself in a way that made acting on what it knew almost impossible. This briefing covers the full record. The 16 days are reconstructed decision by decision, email by email, request by request. What was known, who knew it, who blocked the paths that might have changed the outcome, and what the crew was doing while it was happening. If this is the kind of briefing you want more of, hit subscribe and stay with me. The mission begins now. Open the program file. The Space Shuttle was the most complex flying machine ever built. Each orbiter contained 2.5 million parts. The main engines operated at a chamber pressure of 3,000 pounds per square inch, a condition so extreme that the turbopumps driving propellant into the combustion chambers turned at 28,000 revolutions per minute, running hotter than the boiling point of iron. The thermal protection system, the tiles and reinforced carbon-carbon panels covering the orbiter's surface, had to withstand re-entry heating that reached 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit on the leading edges of the wings. The margin between that temperature and the aluminum airframe behind the tiles was approximately 1 inch of material. The entire system, on every flight, operated with intolerances that left almost no room for degradation. Columbia was the oldest orbiter in the fleet. She had first flown in April 1981, 22 years before her final mission. In those 22 years, she had flown 27 missions. She had logged 300 days in space. She was not a young vehicle. She was a vehicle that had been maintained and modified and repaired across 2 decades of intensive use. And she was still flying because she was certified to fly, because her systems continued to meet the standards NASA required, and because the political and institutional logic of the shuttle program demanded that the fleet remain operational. STS-107 was a dedicated science mission. Columbia was not going to the International Space Station. She was carrying a module called a SpaceHab, packed with 80 separate scientific experiments across fields from combustion physics to bone density research to atmospheric observation. The crew of 7 had trained for years for this specific payload. The mission had been delayed 15 times over 2 years for various scheduling and technical reasons. When Columbia lifted off on January 16, 2003, it was the first time in 2.5 years that her crew had finally gotten airborne. The crew was Commander Rick Husband, pilot William McCool, payload commander Michael Anderson, mission specialists Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, and Laurel Clark, and payload specialist Ilan Ramon, the first Israeli astronaut to fly into space, a former fighter pilot who had participated in the 1981 Israeli airstrike that destroyed Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor. 7 people, 7 careers, 7 families waiting in Houston. 81 seconds after liftoff, a piece of insulating foam detached from the left bipod ramp of the external tank. The bipod ramp was a wedge-shaped piece of a spray-on foam insulation that covered a structural fitting connecting the external tank to the orbiter. It weighed approximately 1.67 pounds. At the moment it separated from the tank, the orbiter was traveling at more than 1,500 miles per hour. The foam suddenly in the airstream decelerated. The orbiter continued forward. The relative velocity between them, the speed at which the foam struck the orbiter's left wing leading edge, was approximately 530 miles per hour. A piece of lightweight insulating foam, roughly the dimensions of a large briefcase, traveling at 530 miles per hour. Now understand what it hit. The leading edges of the shuttle's wings were not protected by standard tiles. They were protected by a material called reinforced carbon-carbon, RCC, a composite of graphite fibers in a carbon matrix, formed into curved panels and fitted together along the wing's leading curve. RCC was designed for one specific purpose: to survive 3,000-degree re-entry heating long enough to protect the aluminum structure behind it. It was extremely good at absorbing thermal energy. It was not designed to absorb kinetic energy. It was not designed to take impacts. It was brittle. A ground-level test of a piece of RCC struck by a shoe sole would leave marks. The foam strike hit RCC panel 8 on the left wing leading edge. The strike was recorded by multiple launch cameras. The images were reviewed the following day. That is when the decision chain began. And that is when the record becomes, in retrospect, almost unbearable to follow. Pull up the launch imagery. The mission management team received the first briefing on the foam strike on Flight Day 2, January 17, 2003. The cameras had captured the impact clearly enough to see the foam separate and strike the wing. What the cameras could not show, because of angle, distance, and image resolution, was what the impact had done to the RCSC panel. The foam was visible. The damage was not. The mission management team was chaired by Linda Ham, a NASA manager with extensive shuttle experience and a well-documented reputation for decisive management. The culture she represented and the culture the Columbia Accident Investigation Board would later reconstruct in granular detail treated foam shedding from the external tank as a known, managed, acceptable phenomenon. This was not irrational on its face. Foam had been shedding from the external tank since the very first shuttle flight in 1981. Orbiters had returned from missions with foam strike damage to tiles. Engineers had assessed the damage. Tiles had been repaired. The shuttle had kept flying. This is the condition the Columbia Accident Investigation Board called normalization of deviance. Diane Vaughn, a sociologist at Columbia University, introduced that term in her 1996 book, Analyzing the Challenger Disaster. She defined it as the process by which a technically abnormal condition is gradually reclassified as normal through repeated exposure without consequence. In the shuttle program, foam shedding was technically a violation of the design specification. The external tank was not supposed to shed foam at all because foam strikes the orbiter. The design requirement was unambiguous, but foam had been shedding for 22 years. Orbiters had come home. No crew had been lost. Each flight without consequence made the next flight with foam shedding slightly more acceptable. The violation became routine. The routine became normal. The normal became invisible. When Linda Ham's team reviewed the Day 2 foam strike briefing, the framing was not, "This could be catastrophic." The framing was, "This is another foam event larger than usual, which we need to understand." That distinction in how a problem is framed before analysis begins determined almost everything that followed. A catastrophic framing demands imaging, demands worst-case analysis, demands immediate escalation. A managed anomaly framing demands paper analysis, produces a conclusion that validates the existing mission plan, and moves on. The mission management team requested an analysis from Boeing, which held the shuttle's structural engineering contract. Boeing engineers ran a software model called Crater, a program designed to predict tile damage from foam strikes. Crater was not validated for foam pieces of this size. The foam that struck Columbia's wing was approximately 400 times larger than any foam piece the Crater model had been calibrated against. This was not a small extrapolation. It was asking a model to predict behavior far outside the boundary conditions it had been built to handle. The Crater output said the damage, while potentially significant, was probably survivable. The mission management team noted the Crater analysis. It validated their existing position. The mission continued. Read the internal communications. On Flight Day 6, January 21, 2003, a group of engineers from NASA's debris assessment team convened to work through the foam strike analysis in more detail. They did not have the authority to demand imaging. They did not have the political standing to override the mission management team's framing, but they had technical expertise, and what that expertise told them was specific and alarmed. Rodney Rocha was the chief structural engineer at NASA's Johnson Space Center, the technical co-chair of the debris assessment team. He had been examining the imagery and the crater output and the fundamental physics of the impact. He wrote an internal email on January 22, 2003, Flight Day 7. The email was addressed to a shuttle program engineering manager named Paul Schack. The email said, "Can we petition, beg for outside agency assistance?" Rocha was asking, carefully knowing the culture he was navigating, whether the team could request imagery from Department of Defense reconnaissance assets. Military satellites and ground-based telescopes operated by the Air Force Space Command had resolution capabilities far exceeding any civilian system. If Columbia's left wing had sustained visible structural damage, those assets might be able to see it. Rocha wanted to ask. He was not the first to have asked. He was the third. The first request for Department of Defense imagery had come on January 17th from a mid-level shuttle program manager who had seen the foam strike footage and independently concluded that higher resolution imagery was needed. That request had been initiated through a NASA liaison to the Department of Defense's Space Command. It was withdrawn before it completed the routing process. The withdrawal was not documented with a formal decision. It simply stopped. The second request came through a different channel from engineers who had been briefed on the foam strike size. That request reached Linda Ham's mission evaluation room. At a meeting on January 21st, Ham told the engineers present that she had killed the imagery request because she didn't want to spend the political capital with the Department of Defense unless the technical case for concern was stronger. She used a phrase that the Columbia Accident Investigation Board later examined at length. She said the imagery would be nice to have, but was not necessary given the current analysis. Nice to have. Of information that might have shown in the wing of a spacecraft re-entering the atmosphere in 11 days, a hole large enough to kill everyone aboard. Rocha's January 22nd email, his third request, framed as a petition to beg, traveled up through his chain of command and reached a shuttle program safety manager named Carlisle Campbell. Campbell forwarded it without adding his own recommendation or urgency to a position above Rocha's in the hierarchy. It sat. It was not acted upon. It was not formally denied. It was not escalated further. Rocha later told investigators he had been afraid to be more assertive. The culture he worked inside, the culture the Columbia Accident Investigation Board would spend 7 months documenting, made it professionally dangerous for an engineer to push past the level where management had already reached a position. There were not threats, there was no coercion, there was something more insidious, a decades-long institutional dynamic in which engineers who persisted past the point of management's comfort were characterized as not being team players, as not understanding the bigger picture, as creating problems rather than solving them. Rocha knew this. The email he sent, "Can we petition? Beg," is a document of a person who understood exactly what the culture permitted him to say and was searching for language careful enough to be heard without being dismissed. The parenthetical "beg" is not casual. It is a man who knew he needed to ask something the system didn't want to answer, trying to frame it softly enough that someone might listen. No one with authority listened in time. Scan the mission timeline. While the debris assessment team wrote emails and the imagery requests died in transit, the crew of STS-107 was working. This is the part of the record that the public reporting, in its focus on the management failures, sometimes moves past too quickly. For 16 days, 7 human beings were doing exactly what they had trained to do, with the full competence and dedication that a career in spaceflight requires. The 80 science experiments ran on a schedule. Combustion tests were conducted. Protein crystal growth samples were monitored. The Israeli experiment studying dust and sand transport in the atmosphere, Ilan Ramon's primary payload contribution, produced data that was transmitted to the ground. The crew had no reason to worry about re-entry. They had not been told about the foam strike in any way that conveyed urgency. Mission controllers had briefed Commander Rick Husband that foam had struck the wing during launch, presenting it in the context in which the mission management team had framed it. A manageable anomaly under analysis, not a concern for operations. Husband was a meticulous commander. He asked follow-up questions. He was told the situation was understood and that re-entry procedures were nominal. Husband trusted the people on the ground. He had every institutional reason to. The people on the ground were NASA engineers, shuttle program managers, the mission management team. They had flown 111 shuttle missions. They had managed anomalies and recovered from them. They were the people who kept astronauts alive. What husband did not know, what no one had the authority or the will to tell him, was that the debris assessment team's internal analysis had reached conclusions that the official mission management team position did not reflect. The DAT had classified the foam piece as out of family, a technical term meaning outside the range of previously observed events for which the outcome was understood. The crater analysis that management was relying on had been produced by a model never validated for impacts of this size. The 3 requests for imagery that might have resolved the uncertainty had all been blocked. There is a scenario the Columbia Accident Investigation Board examined carefully, and the public discussion of the disaster often does not: rescue. When Columbia launched on January 16th, Space Shuttle Atlantis was in Orbiter Processing Facility Bay, one at Kennedy Space Center, being prepared for the next shuttle mission, STS-114. The CAIB's analysis concluded that a rescue mission, accelerating Atlantis's preparation, launching before Columbia's consumables ran out, was theoretically achievable within the mission's timeline if the decision to attempt rescue had been made early enough. Early enough means within approximately the first week of Columbia's mission, before the consumables margin became critically narrow. If the imagery requests had been fulfilled on day 2 or day 3, and if that imagery had shown visible damage to the RCC panels, and if the mission management team had escalated to NASA leadership, and if NASA leadership had authorized an emergency preparation of Atlantis, the sequence of conditionals is long, and each one represents a decision that the institutional culture of the shuttle program made less likely. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board did not conclude that rescue was certain. It concluded that rescue was possible, and that possibility was never seriously evaluated because the mission management team had decided within the first 2 days that the foam strike was not a problem requiring that level of response. The crew could have been told. There was a version of those 16 days in which husband received a different briefing, one that said, "We have an anomaly we cannot fully characterize. We are requesting high-resolution imagery, and there is a possibility we may be evaluating contingency options." In that version, the crew would have known their situation. They would have been able to make informed decisions about their remaining time. They would have had the dignity of knowing. That briefing was never sent. Set the re-entry clock. February 1st, 2003, Flight Day 16, Columbia's crew woke at 3:15 a.m. Eastern Time and began re-entry preparations. Entry was scheduled to conclude with a landing at Kennedy Space Center at 9:16 a.m. The weather over Florida was clear. The mission had gone well by every metric the crew had been given access to. The science was complete. The spacecraft was in good condition as far as anyone aboard her knew. At 8:44:09 a.m., Columbia hit the upper atmosphere at 400,000 feet altitude, traveling at approximately 12,500 miles per hour. The process of re-entry generates heat through compression of the air ahead of the orbiter, not through friction, as the common explanation states, but through the adiabatic heating of air being compressed faster than it can conduct that energy away. The leading edges of the wings at peak heating reach 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The aluminum structure of the wing begins to fail at approximately 1,200 degrees. The RCC panels on the leading edge exist to absorb those 3,000 degrees long enough for the orbiter to slow to a speed at which temperatures drop to survivable levels. Panel 8 on the left wing leading edge had a hole in it. The hole, confirmed later through recovered debris analysis, trajectory reconstruction, and computer modeling, was created by the foam impact 81 seconds after launch. It measured somewhere between 6 and 10 inches in diameter. In the vacuum of orbit, a hole of that size in a leading edge panel produces no measurable effect on the spacecraft's behavior. Spacecraft pressurize internally. Space does not push back. For 16 days, Columbia flew with a breach in her thermal protection system that produced no symptom the crew could detect, no alarm, no performance anomaly. Re-entry removed that protection. At 8:48 a.m., sensors in the left wing began recording elevated temperatures. The data showed a slow, steady rise inconsistent with normal re-entry heating profiles. Within 2 minutes, sensors in the left wheel well, behind the landing gear doors, deep inside the wing structure, showed temperatures climbing past the normal operating range. Mission Control in Houston began seeing anomalous data at 8:52 a.m. The flight controllers monitoring the vehicle systems watched the left wing temperature readings tick upward. At 8:54 a.m., contact was lost with temperature sensors in the left wing. Not elevated readings, lost readings, sensors going offline. A flight director named Leroy Kane was working the console. His team was watching the data streams. At 8:59:32 a.m., Houston attempted to contact Columbia's crew with a routine communication. The crew, Commander Husband, replied with a partial transmission that was cut off mid-sentence. The transmission said, "Roger, bah." Those were the last words received from Space Shuttle Columbia. At approximately 9 a.m., over the Texas-Louisiana border region at an altitude of approximately 200,000 feet, Columbia's left wing failed. The aerodynamic forces of hypersonic flight, acting on a wing no longer structurally intact, exceeded the orbiter's ability to maintain attitude. The vehicle departed controlled flight. At the velocities and atmospheric densities of re-entry, the forces produced by loss of control are fatal to an aluminum airframe within seconds. Columbia broke apart. The debris field stretched from eastern Texas to western Louisiana, covering 2.3 million acres. Recovery teams would spend months collecting 84,000 pieces of debris across that field, approximately 38% of the orbiter's dry weight. Residents across East Texas heard the sonic booms of the debris traveling overhead at hypersonic speed. Many described thinking it was a low-flying aircraft. Others described it as thunder. Dashcam footage from Texas roads captured the streak of multiple burning objects crossing the morning sky. All 7 crew members were killed. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board's forensic analysis of the recovered crew module established that the crew experienced loss of cabin pressure, followed by loss of consciousness and death within seconds of the vehicle's structural failure. They did not survive long enough to experience the vehicle's final breakup. Whether that knowledge is consolation or a form of its own horror is not a question the investigation could answer. Open the investigation record. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board was convened within hours of the orbiter's loss. It was chaired by Admiral Harold Geeman Jr., a retired Navy admiral with no prior involvement in the shuttle program, a deliberate choice, ensuring independence from the institutional culture being investigated. The board had 13 members, including physicists, aeronautical engineers, former military officers, and former NASA administrators. It worked for 7 months. The board's findings divided the cause of the accident into 2 categories. The first was technical: the foam strike, the breach in panel 8, the superheated plasma entering the wing structure during re-entry, the failure of the left wing, the breakup of the vehicle. This was the proximate physical cause. It was reconstructed with extraordinary precision. The trajectory of the foam, the velocity of impact, the hole size, the heating profiles, the sequence of sensor failures, the exact point of a structural failure. The physical record, for all its horror, submitted to reconstruction. The physics did what physics does. The second category was organizational. The board called it NASA's organizational causes. This section of the report is, in the long history of accident investigation literature, one of the more unflinching documents a government-commissioned inquiry has ever produced about itself. The board found that the decision-making culture inside the shuttle program had evolved over decades into a system that was structurally resistant to bad news. The normalization of deviance that Diane Vaughan had documented after Challenger had not been corrected. It had persisted and deepened. Engineers who raised concerns through informal channels were not heard. Formal safety channels had been restructured in ways that reduced rather than increased the flow of technical concerns to management. The mission management team's meeting structure, the room, the hierarchy, the language conventions, made it very difficult for an engineer without appropriate authority to raise an objection that would be taken seriously. The board interviewed Linda Ham at length. Its assessment of her decision-making was unsparing. It found that her direction not to pursue the imagery requests was not the product of malice or deliberate disregard for the crew's safety. It was the product of a management framework that had, over years, and flights and returned orbiters, become systematically incapable of correctly pricing low probability, high consequence risks. The difference is critical. The board did not find a cover-up in the sense of deliberate concealment of known danger. What it found was something more complex and, in some ways, more disturbing. A system in which the danger was partially visible and the system nonetheless organized itself to look away, not through dishonesty, through the accumulated institutional logic of 2 decades of successful flights, 2 decades of foam shedding without catastrophe, 2 decades of engineers raising concerns and being told, truthfully, based on previous experience, that things had worked out fine. The 3 imagery requests are the clearest evidence of this dynamic. The imagery was available. The Air Force Space Command had assets that could resolve objects significantly smaller than a damaged leading-edge panel from orbital altitudes. The technical capability to see what had happened to Columbia's wing existed, and it existed within the Department of Defense's inventory, and it was accessible through established NASA DoD coordination channels. The board confirmed this. It was not a question of technology. The technology was there. What was not there was an organizational culture in which the people who understood the risk had the authority to demand the imagery, and the people who had the authority to demand it understood the risk. Between technical understanding and organizational authority, there was a gap. In that gap, 3 requests died. The board also addressed directly the question of rescue. Its analysis confirmed that a rescue mission with Atlantis was feasible if the decision to attempt it had been made by approximately Flight Day 5, January 20th, 2003, 4 days into the mission. That window required imaging to have been obtained and analyzed by Day 3, a decision to attempt rescue to have been made by Day 4, and Atlantis's preparation to have begun immediately. It was achievable, it was tight, it required every part of a complex institutional response to work correctly and quickly. The window closed, not because of a single decision on a single day, but because the mission management team's Day 2 framing of the foam strike as a manageable anomaly meant that no one with authority ever asked the question the rescue window required. Is the crew safe? And if we are uncertain, what do we do about the uncertainty? That question was never formally asked. The board found no evidence that the mission management team ever convened to evaluate worst-case scenarios for the foam strike. No meeting, no documented analysis, no escalation to NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe. The worst case was not modeled. The worst case was, in the institutional language of the mission management team, not a credible concern, until it was the only scenario that remained. Read the emails. Rodney Rocha's emails are in the public record now. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board published them in their report's appendices. They are available. Anyone can read them. On January 22nd, 2003, 6 days into the mission, 11 days before Columbia's crew would die, Rocha wrote to a colleague, "I could be off base, but I am really worried about the impact on the RCSC wing panels. I'm not sure I see how we will be able to assess how bad the hit is with just photographic analysis tools. This needs to be worked fast." On January 23rd, after learning that a formal request for DoD imagery had been submitted and had subsequently been withdrawn without explanation, he wrote, "I wanted to make sure you were aware of the imaging request withdrawal. I am very concerned about it. I'm not trying to be a hero or a troublemaker, just trying to do what's right." On January 24th, after the mission management team's meeting had been briefed on the Boeing crater analysis and had concluded the foam strike was acceptable. In my humble technical opinion, this is the wrong conclusion, and there is insufficient data to close out this issue. He sent these emails. He documented his concerns formally in writing through the channels available to him. The emails went up through the management chain. They did not produce a reversal of the imagery decision. They did not produce a formal worst-case analysis. They did not produce a change in the mission management team's position. They are in the public record now because the board required everything to be disclosed. At the time, they were internal emails from a mid-level engineer expressing concern about a decision his management had already made. In the culture of the shuttle program's mission management team, they were precisely the kind of concern that had been expressed about previous foam events and had each time turned out to be an overreaction. Except this time, It was not an overreaction. There's another email in the record that the board examined. It was written by a Boeing engineer named Carlisle Campbell in response to the initial crater analysis showing that the foam impact could potentially cause significant damage. The email observed that if the analysis was correct, there was nothing NASA could do about it anyway. Columbia was in orbit with no repair capability, and therefore the right approach was to wait for the problem to bite us during entry and then address it in post-mission analysis. The logic is, in its own way, coherent. If you cannot repair the damage and cannot bring the crew home early, what does knowing the worst case accomplish beyond creating panic? The argument has a certain institutional pragmatism to it. What it does not contain is any consideration of rescue, any consideration of a contingency mission, any consideration of extending the mission to preserve the crew's options while Atlantis was prepared. The calculation that nothing could be done was made before the calculation of what might be done was seriously attempted. The board found this dynamic across multiple documents and multiple decision makers. The assumption that nothing could be done had been established so early and so informally that it shaped every subsequent analysis without ever being formally examined and validated. Close the mission briefing, pull out the final report. The question this investigation set out to answer is, did NASA see the problem and did they say nothing? The answer the evidence requires is more precise than yes or no. Here is what the record confirms without ambiguity. NASA saw the foam strike on day 2. The mission management team was briefed. The foam piece was identified as significantly larger than anything in the previous database of foam events, outside the range of characterized impacts by a factor the crater model was not designed to handle. This was documented. This was known. 3 separate requests for Department of Defense imagery were initiated through 3 separate channels. All 3 were blocked, withdrawn, or canceled before they produced imagery. This is not disputed. The board confirmed the sequence, confirmed that the imagery was technically obtainable, and confirmed that the decisions to block or withdraw the requests were made by specific individuals in specific meetings. The crew was not informed of the uncertainty about their vehicle's structural integrity. Commander Husband received a briefing that presented the foam strike as a managed anomaly. He was not told that engineers on the ground were writing alarmed emails, that 3 imagery requests had been blocked, or that the analysis being used to characterize the damage had been produced by a model never validated at this impact size. He was told the situation was understood. It was not fully understood. Here is what the record does not confirm. The record does not confirm that anyone inside NASA's shuttle program knew with certainty that Columbia was doomed and chose to conceal that certainty from the crew. The management decision-making documented in the CAIB report is not a cover-up. It is something more complicated. A set of judgments made inside an institutional framework that systematically undervalued low-probability catastrophic risk. The people who blocked the imagery requests believed, based on the accumulated experience of the shuttle program and the crater analysis, that the foam strike was survivable. They were wrong. They were wrong in a way that the institutional culture had made it very difficult for the people who suspected they were wrong to reach them. Here is what remains genuinely ambiguous. Whether imagery would have definitively shown a fatal breach in Panel 8 is not fully resolved. The board's analysis suggested that a trained photo interpreter examining high-resolution imagery of the left wing leading edge would likely have identified abnormalities warranting immediate escalation. But likely is the board's word, not certainly. The wing at the angle Columbia was orbiting would have presented at an angle that might have obscured the full extent of the damage. Whether the imagery, if obtained, would have produced a clear enough picture to change the mission management team's assessment is something the record cannot answer with certainty because the imagery was never obtained. What the rescue scenario establishes is this: the ambiguity itself was reason enough to try, not certainty that the crew was doomed, ambiguity that they might be. Ambiguity is precisely the condition in which obtaining more information, high-resolution imagery in this case, is the rational response. The institutional logic that blocked the imagery requests was not the logic of certainty. It was the logic of an organization that had learned over 22 years of foam strikes without catastrophe to resolve ambiguity in the direction of the existing mission plan. That learning killed 7 people. The honest timeline of this disaster begins not on January 16, 2003, when Columbia launched. It begins in 1981, when foam first shed from the external tank, and the response was to note it, study it, and continue flying. It runs through every flight in which foam shed, and the orbiter returned, and the record was annotated as an acceptable condition. It runs through the Challenger accident in 1986, through the Rogers Commission report that documented the normalization of deviance in the O-ring erosion problem, through the return to flight and the 17 subsequent years in which the lesson of Challenger was stated but not institutionally absorbed. The honest timeline is 22 years long. NASA did not say nothing because they chose to deceive. They said nothing because they had built an institution that could not clearly hear from the people who understood the risk that this time was different. 7 people went to work on a Saturday morning in February. Rick Husband, the commander, had a habit of waking the crew with a different song each morning. He had a reputation among his crew for choosing songs that meant something. Country, hymns, things that put the day in some larger frame. William McCool, his pilot, was flying his first spaceflight. Kalpana Chawla, the mission specialist who had survived a close call on a previous mission, had a way of explaining physics experiments to her crewmates that made the work feel immediate and worth doing. David Brown, the physician astronaut, had spent the mission photographing Earth through the windows and had accumulated a collection of images he was looking forward to showing his family. Laurel Clark had been emailing her family throughout the mission. Her husband and 8-year-old son were waiting in Florida. Ilan Ramon, who had carried into space a drawing made by a teenage boy who died in Auschwitz, a drawing of Earth as seen from space, had been thinking throughout the mission about what it meant to see his country from orbit for the first time. Michael Anderson, the payload commander, had told colleagues before the mission that he felt called to spaceflight in a way he described as larger than his own ambition. He had a habit, in conversations about risk, of saying that he had peace about it. These are not elegiac add-ons to the technical record, they are part of the same record. The CAIB report, the imagery requests, the crater model, the emails from Rodney Rocha, they are the same document as those people on that Saturday morning beginning their descent without knowing what their descent was. The debris field across East Texas has been mapped in detail. Recovery teams worked for months across pine forest and farmland. More than 84,000 pieces were recovered. Some of those pieces were science experiments the crew had been running, still partially intact, still containing data. The data was recovered and published. The experiments the crew had given 16 days to were not entirely lost. There's a version of this story that ends with systemic reform, with the post-Columbia changes to NASA's safety culture, the new imagery request protocols, the debris inspection procedures that now accompany every shuttle mission, the retirement of the shuttle program itself in 2011. Those reforms are real. The shuttle never flew again without in-flight inspection of the thermal protection system. The normalization of deviance that the board had documented and named was addressed, imperfectly and over years, as an institutional priority in a way it had not been before. The reform is the right ending if the story is about the institution. The institution changed. The story is also about 7 people who deserved to know. That part of the story does not have a reform ending. It only has the record, the emails that were sent but not acted on, the requests that were filed and withdrawn, the briefing that was given and the briefing that was withheld, and the 16 days that followed, during which 7 people did their jobs in a spacecraft with a hole in its wing and waited to come home. The file closes here. The names are on the record now. The decisions that led there have been walked through, decision by decision, in full. That is the only thing we owe the people who did not come back.